Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Aaron Boyd, Senior Editor for Technology and Events at Nextgov, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Cybersmart 2020, Protecting Government's Bandwidth, hosted by Nextgov and Route 50, and underwritten by Carasoft and RSA. There's been a major spike in government's need for fast and reliable network bandwidth, especially as America's digital divide becomes more and more apparent through the COVID-19 pandemic. What ways are federal agencies, as well as state and local entities, making sure that they have the broadband capabilities to provide their citizens with the digital services they need? How are leaders working to upgrade their systems securely? Today, we're exploring those questions and specific use cases and strategies for protecting the government's digital infrastructure. But before we get started with the program, I'd like to point out the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. That's how you'll be able to ask questions. We'll be fielding those about halfway through the program, but feel free to submit along the way so we can get right to them when the time comes. This webcast is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. Now, to begin our program, joining me today is Angela Seifer, Executive Director at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, Sean Connolly, Trusted Internet Connections Program Manager at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Jim Russo, Technical Director of the Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions Program at the Office of Integrated Technology Category at the General Services Administration. So as we get started, Angela, let's start with you. Who are you? What do you do? And that title I just read off, what does that have to do with bandwidth issues?
Who am I and what do I do? That's great. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We've been around for 5 years. I've been doing digital inclusion work for over 20 years. Digital inclusion is the activities that get us to digital equity. And digital equity is all communities and individuals having full access to information communication technologies to do whatever it is they need to do. So digital inclusion are the activities that get us there. Pre-COVID, it was public access internet. That's not really useful anymore. So it's really about that home access, having the right device and having the digital skills to use it. So NDIA both helps those on the ground who are doing the work to connect to each other, learn from each other. We write up best practices, etc. We used to have conferences, maybe someday we will again. And then we also do the advocacy work that supports the folks on the ground.
Excellent. So we're going to come back to you to dig more into kind of the state of things as we get going in this conversation. But before we get there, let's meet our other panelists as well. Sean, who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. My name is Sean Connolly. I work at CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. I lead the TIC program. TIC stands TIC, Trusted Internet Connections. And it's the federal government's strategy and architecture of how different agencies, the federal agencies, will connect to the internet and secure their networks. And for a long time, for the last 10 plus years or so, there's been a policy from the White House down through OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, about how to connect using some traditional network architectures. But at coincidentally the same time that the pandemic hit, OMB released a new policy, and been working with Jim Russo and the GSA team for a long time on this. We've been able to support a total new type of architecture, or a bunch of different architectures, if you will. And it's exactly to talk about, or to meet what we're talking about today in terms of, we recognize that federal presence certainly isn't just in the national capital region. It's both around the United States with offices, and then around the globe with your federal or your foreign presence. So it's a great opportunity in terms of talking about how those distributed networks can be secure under this new policy.
Excellent. And Jim, what kind of work are you doing?
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Yes, as you mentioned, technical director for our Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions program, in addition to my role as branch chief in Solutions Development Office of Telecommunication Services. So what we do is we develop and manage contracts that provide telecommunications, network bandwidth, other services to federal and civilian and DoD agencies, and for ourselves. So what those include are different varieties of bandwidth that can be used for day-to-day use. It was a big jolt when COVID spawned 100% telework, and a lot of agencies suddenly had to order up a lot of extra bandwidth and figure out ways of how to manage their services and deliver them to citizens when they themselves were also teleworking. So that's where we're concentrating. As Sean mentioned, we also have our cybersecurity requirements baked in with the assistance of CISA and the TIC program. So as we go forward, we're looking to be the hub of IT modernization for federal agencies that we deal with.
Excellent. So Jim, I want to start with you to help set the table here. Some of our audience is highly technical. Some of them are just kind of getting into these issues. So let's start off with, when we say we're talking about bandwidth issues, what are we talking about? It's a series of tubes and the tubes get clogged? What's the problem here?
Well, I guess specifically in the legacy type of trusted internet connection architecture, which a lot of agencies are still using because they just haven't moved forward yet, or haven't had the requirements together yet to move forward. It's created sort of a hub and spoke situation when you're talking about network architecture. So now you've got all the remote users coming in to, let's say, a central location or a set of central locations for the agency to access both the agency's hosted resources, let's say data center or file structure or some things like that, in addition to getting to the cloud. So most of the agencies have cloud-based network, at least a hybrid network, in addition to things that they already have on premises. So a lot of them are still trying to employ the legacy services, which are in place for cybersecurity, assuming that all the resources are within a well-defined perimeter, and that perimeter centrally located or at least under the control of the agency. So it's created the need right away for additional bandwidth to go through those, I'll call them choke points, so that the teleworkers could do business. So immediately that was, hey, we need more bandwidth for what we call our Managed Trusted Internet Protocol Service, or MTIPS, so that we can continue to do business, continuity of service, right? So at the same time, a lot of agencies are also looking at how do they modernize what they need, going from legacy types of bandwidth, TDM-based services to Ethernet, voice services from legacy to voice over IP, and try to do that all at the same time, right? So within that structure, we're looking at, okay, how can we help them with continuity of service and then move forward? So to that end, I'll also real quickly mention that we rolled out a software-defined wide area network service on our EIS contract. Not that we couldn't do that before, but it's a much easier way for agencies and industry to see how those services might be provided now and can be ordered up. So, so at the same time, we're trying to keep continuity of service. We're also trying to modernize. So it's changing the wheels while the car's rolling.
And I want to get back to the SD-WAN thing later. But before we move on from this topic, first off, it's worth noting for anybody out there who's not aware of this massive contract, EIS, it's the telecom contract that all federal agencies are shifting and moving over toward. As you mentioned, Jim, there's a big modernization push within that. But before the pandemic hit, how big were the bandwidth issues for most agencies? Was this a problem, or were most people, even before they were getting ready to transition, did they have enough flowing through so that they could manage day to day, or has this been a perennial issue?
I wouldn't say that the amount of bandwidth was the issue. The efficiency of the bandwidth might be an issue, because when you're ordering point-to-point circuits at committed data rates, so your fill rate, in terms of, you can think of that as using everything that you've ordered, right? If you've ordered a circuit, let's say 100 megabits per second, just to keep it easy, and most of the time you're using 50, or you might surge to 75. Well, you're leaving the rest of it on the table. You're paying for bandwidth you're not using. And so I think there was more a case of that. When you employ an SD-WAN type solution, you can smooth out that, the need for your bandwidth. You can more efficiently manage your burst if you need bursted services or things like that. So I think it was more a case of efficiency versus not enough.
Interesting. Very interesting. So as promised, I want to go back to Angela here, and let's talk about the national position. Where are we with, because if we're going to talk about bandwidth, I think we have to talk about broadband, right? If everybody was 56K, it doesn't matter how much you're getting. It's just not going to move fast enough. So what's the map look like right now across the states? Does everybody have access to high-speed internet?
So everyone does not have access to high-speed internet. It's also important to clarify the difference between having availability to high-speed internet and actually subscribing to high-speed internet. So we don't have good maps. We don't have good numbers because the FCC is in charge of the data and the maps, and there is bipartisan agreement that the maps are not accurate. The internet service providers have overstated it. I know you all are super surprised to hear that. But that's the reality of it. There are efforts to fix that. Are they enough efforts? I guess we'll find out when we see the maps. But so we don't know the availability part. We have a little bit better idea on the adoption part of it because that's data that we can get from census. So that's survey data where they're actually asking households. And so that data you can go easily find. American Community Survey, census, you can get down to the track level, but that's at 5-year data. So it's going to be a little bit out of date, but it still gives you a good idea. And what we know for sure is that the reasons folks don't adopt is that it's too expensive, which New America came out today actually with a report explaining just how expensive the US is, which, in case anybody's curious, we are the most expensive. That's super. So there's the expense part, and then there's the digital literacy part. So we have a lot of households in the US and individuals who don't use the internet because they don't know how to use it, really. They might be able to get on Facebook, but that might be the limit of their abilities. So the numbers in the US that we are comfortable using are the ones from American Community Survey that tell us 18 million US households do not have broadband in their home. Census defines broadband as anything above dial-up. Take that for what it's worth.
So what are the just in case everybody, because not everybody necessarily thinks about these things because they get their internet access and that's the end of it. So outside of dial-up, what else do we have? We have broadband, DSL, satellite,
DSL, fiber, cable, right? And those census numbers, that 18 million number includes mobile.
Okay.
And there are some folks for whom mobile that is their internet source, but really there's a data cap, so they don't fully use it like those of us who have a wireline service. And that 18 million is all US households. 14 million of that 18 million are in urban areas, 4 million are in rural areas. So the perception that it's a problem about availability, we do have an availability problem, but it's not our only problem. We also have an adoption problem.
So when we talk about securing bandwidth to deliver citizen services for governments, right? What actions can governments from the federal level down to the state and local level take to ensure that if they're going to do all this work to build up their networks and deliver these services, that the people on the other side can access them and also have the same infrastructure to do that?
It is super fascinating right now that during this crisis era, the awareness of the lack of broadband in folks' homes, the reasons why they don't have it in their home is that more governments are doing exactly that. They're looking at, okay, what fiber do we have? What resources, what infrastructure do we have that we might be able to use to get this really essential service? Nobody wants to call it a utility if they're in the ISP world. Folks on the ground want to call it a utility, right? It is an essential service. So how can the governments help them? And it has to do with how can they make that infrastructure available? Do they want to become an ISP? Some do, some don't. 22 states say you're not allowed to, actually, if you're a government. But there's the option of still using that infrastructure to get to folks by letting other ISPs use that fiber.
Excellent. So Sean, we don't want you to fall asleep over there from not being on screen. So I wanted to shift over to you and move to the other side of that security, right? If we're going to secure the ability to connect, let's also secure the connection itself. So what's some of the work you're doing and how has that changed in the current pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So Jim talked about it, explained it very well in terms of that hub and spoke. And so for a long time, a lot of the federal agencies, especially on the West Coast, or if they're out, have a mission space around the world, all that traffic had to come back to the hub, which typically was in the DC area before it get out to maybe to different websites or to cloud environments and stuff. And so what we were talking about a little earlier with the release of the new policy, now it's possible to start looking at new ways to possibly access those cloud environments for their internal systems, or maybe access cloud systems that may be supporting external portals and such, but new ways to access those services without having to go through that traditional hub. You mentioned before that the hub and spoke, so just across the United States, right? You can't change the speed of light. And so the time it takes to get across from West Coast to East Coast is around 40 milliseconds. That's pretty high for some modern day systems. Then you start looking at like what it takes to reach those same systems from, we'll just say the middle of Africa or somewhere in Central Asia. It could take well over 800 milliseconds for that same transaction to happen. It may be going up to satellite or two, right up to a bird and back down and up to another bird and down. So there's a lot of just that latency that we're talking about. And on the opposite side, you have modern services, which they're not even focusing on milliseconds between the transactions anymore. It's more down to microseconds. So it's really a challenge just in terms of the availability on one side, but ultimately to your point, where's security coming to play? And that's why I think what you're seeing, and Jim and I have been working on this for a long time, is how that security is now being distributed out closer to the client side, if it is, or closer to the server side. There's still plenty of opportunity in the middle of that path, if you will, but just having more distributed networks out there, but still securing them to the same level that we had when we had that traditional hub and spoke architecture.
Mm. So I can see how obviously moving those security systems and some of that load out to the edge versus having to come all the way back would definitely help with some of the lag issue. Does it introduce any other security issues though? Particularly that asymmetry, right? If somebody's moving real fast and somebody's moving real slow, do you need a different security architecture to manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So how do you have that policy parity? So you have agencies that are pretty comfortable with their security stacks and their firewall stacks and what that can provide them in terms of visibility and security. But as they move and outsource some of that security to new solutions, whether it may be a cloud access service broker, or maybe they're using the cloud services that are embedded in the like the different cloud providers themselves, there are a lot of the objectives are the same, but the principles are the same. But when you start using those cloud services or using a CASB, it's not exactly the same as when it was before. And so the challenges from the agency side is having that broader awareness, that broader education of if we're going to do this with this new way, what are the differences? I don't want to call them hacks, but what are the different ways you have to just make that new service work to the same level or better optimally than it is right now. So there's a large education gap that has to go on when you start looking at all these new architectures.
Another thing Jim mentioned before was that it's not always just about increasing bandwidth. It's often about being more efficient in how it's used. Is that what you're seeing too, or particularly during this pandemic as things have to scale up? Are people just going out there and trying to purchase more and trying to lay new cable, or are there ways that they can use their existing infrastructure differently?
Yeah, I think to your point, I think it's more like an augmentation of their existing infrastructure and look at new ways, maybe to have overlays on top of the existing infrastructure. There is still at the same time just simple capacity issues where you have to buy more, whether it's the bandwidth or the servers or whatever. But it's also just exploring new ways to do that same transaction to the same level of policy and security, but through a different process altogether, possibly.
That was nice that you could do some actual process re-engineering instead of just slapping some a sticker over something. So
Aaron, let me jump in here. So
sure.
Pick up on a couple of things that Angela and Sean mentioned and try to tie them together. So when you're talking about bandwidth, especially broadband, for just put it in a personal user's consumption profile. If you're going to sign up with a local ISP and you're going to buy a service for your house, you're buying a package that gives you both access to the bandwidth and the bandwidth transport. So you're getting that all for a bundled price. Typically, when agencies buy bandwidth through our MPLS service or our direct internet access service, it includes two portions. One is you buy your access connection, so you can think of that as the last mile, and then you buy your port, which is your transport over long distance. So you might be able to, if you can reach, like in my particular home situation, if I can reach a mile away from me where there's a fiber going to a copper mux, I have all the bandwidth in the world, but I got to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So, it took a long time for Comcast in this case to decide I was worthy of, having that service, right? Having that access. So when Angela was talking about access to the broadband, that's like a real life example. When you're working with something like a Wi-Fi hotspot, or I'll call them just the LTE, either your phone or a separate little thing you can use as a hotspot. That all works fine as long as you're close enough to a tower to get any real type of throughput. And that depends on which way the wind's blowing, whether there's leaves on the trees, whether it's raining. And so there's a lot of factors that go into just people having access to the broadband. And then the price, as a lot of those folks find out, for what they get is exorbitant when you compare it to what a typical person in an urban setting gets. And as Angela mentioned, just because you're in an urban setting doesn't mean you have good access either. Could be that somebody doesn't want to tear up a road to put in that last link to your business or to your home. So that's a real big part of it. It's something that we're spending some time looking into now as we flesh out some of the broadband internet type of services that we might offer on EIS. So,
well, and that was where I was going to go next. It was
Yeah.
perfect that you went there, because one of the things EIS does that's different than some of the older telecom contracts is you all tried to bring in more small business providers. There's 3 on the contract right now. Talking about that and other locality issues. How many, either you might have seen like through GSA, your own agency, or other agencies you've been working with, how many of them are having these remote issues? So not telework issues, but like where they're in a location where there just isn't, the service providers aren't necessarily there. Are you seeing that with agencies, or are they mostly in areas with high connectivity?
well, I mean, there's a couple of examples that are kind of standing the test of time still out there. One is the Park Service. When I used to run the satellite comms program for GSA, I got a call from a lady out in, I don't know where she was, Wyoming. And her question to me was, have you ever seen Dances with Wolves? And I said, yeah. She said, well, that's where I am. And I can't get anything. So I need satellite service. There's a lot of those locations still out there. And they depend on satellite services. And the satellite broadband has improved over the years, but there's still, you can't rewrite the laws of physics. There's still a latency there because you've got to reach 22,000 miles away from you round trip for most of those services. There's also another example that's pretty common is DoD. They have recruiting centers in every strip mall across the nation. They don't need a really expensive connection to a network, using an MPLS service or direct internet access. A lot of times they just want to buy whatever business internet they can grab onto. So yeah, and then again, I think Angela sort of touched on this. What's the definition of broadband? It depends on what you're doing. Everybody thinks the FCC has some definition of what minimum broadband is, and they really don't. And they have a table, and the table says, oh, what are you doing? Are you doing just streaming audio? Well, you don't need a very link for that. You just need a tiny link, and that works just fine. Are you telecommuting? Are you using a VPN? Well, now you need more. If you're gaming, you shouldn't be doing work for the government. So,
unless your job is to do gaming for the government, that does happen.
Unless your job is to hack the games or something like that. But
it's training.
By and large, you get the point. It depends on what you're doing.
And I think that's right, though. The minimum requirements do vary depending upon what you're doing. But for lots of families now, those minimum requirements have gone up.
Yeah.
Never before have we had, both parents and a couple of the kids who are all supposed to be on a video with colleagues or students, their teachers at the same time.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. And Jim, I want to go back to you on that because it does tie into something you were just talking about as well, which is as you're building a contract to help agencies do all of this, it's obvious that you've been thinking about these things. So what did you build into the contract to help them stay agile in that way? And as you talk about that, did this pandemic just blow all that up? Because you can talk about trying to be agile, but this, to Angela's point, is a completely different beast than anybody ever anticipated for this infrastructure.
Well, actually, the contract was pretty resilient and was able to quickly respond to a lot of those needs. We were able to because we'd already built in the scope and a pretty extensive geographically available service matrix, so that we had already told the companies in advance, here's our usage profile, here's where our locations are. So here's a geographic area, and we literally had them price services to just to get on board. 25 of the top 100 core-based statistical areas, to be exact. So with the full encouragement that they really needed to cover as many of the 929 CBSAs that we defined and price them too. Now, it doesn't make sense for all the companies, especially maybe some of the small businesses, but most of the companies have stepped up to that. And I would say to your earlier question, which I really didn't answer, that the small businesses do have a role here. So you have MetTel and you have CoreTech and Microtech are the three smalls. And we have non-incumbents like Granite and Harris as well. So a company like Granite or Core is used to doing business as an integrator, Harris for that matter too. And they can say, oh, okay, we're going to get you the best in class across the country. And they're used to dealing with all the local ISPs or telecoms providers and putting that into a common package and being basically the single point of contact for an agency to say, okay, I want service. Here's my profile. Here's where my locations are. And can you bundle that all together and give it to me as a package? And that's what they do. So that's a big value added for our program.
Hey, Jim, I don't want to sell you short, right? So one of the values of EIS also is the flexibility. So on the old networks contract, security is always going to be at the front of the technology life cycle. And so one of the challenges in the old networks contract was just how do you introduce new security features into the networks contract? And one thing Jim's team has done a great job with the new EIS vehicle is we recognize that there will always be new security technologies coming out. And how can we then be able to position those for adoption across .gov much faster, much quicker than it was the old networks contract. So that's definitely a plus. And then also another one I know Jim's team's been very vocal on is the visibility. So as there's this more push toward gaining a better awareness of, from the agency's perspective, of how that transaction is secure or what's going on across that whole system architecture, is getting that visibility to the agency, both for troubleshooting and optimization efficiencies.
Excellent.
Right. And I'll toss a few bouquets back to Sean here just real quick. In that, when we developed the requirements for the program, Sean and his cohorts were front and center in helping us develop the cybersecurity requirements. And not only just the requirements that we put in from day one, but the scope and the breadth and the flexibility later. So we defined a managed security services area within the contract that didn't have everything we needed at the beginning. And probably if you think 5 years from now, it doesn't have everything that we're going to need 5 years from now, but it's given us the umbrella to add those things as they become commercially available. So to that extent, we've put cybersecurity in the center of all of our transport requirements.
TIC and EIS, a romance for our time. So, Jim, one other thing, you mentioned that from the very beginning, you've already had to make some changes, and you're ready, 5 years from now to make changes as needed. But as we've been talking about throughout this webcast, and all anybody's been talking about for the last few months, we're in the middle of unprecedented times, right? So, have there been a lot of changes at the agency, the task order level? Have you seen anyone come back and say, we thought we knew what we were doing, and then the pandemic hit. We need to completely revise our EIS solicitations and bids?
I haven't seen that much of that, really. It's been, as Sean used the word earlier, it's been more of an augmentation thing. So we haven't seen any. I wouldn't say haven't seen any, but we haven't seen many agencies come and say, "Oh, give it back. We're going to completely redo it." I think it's more of, okay, now that we've had the scope review and we're within scope, now we might want to tweak it a little bit before we put it out for solicitation. We know some of that's going on, but not wholesale changes.
So I'm going to go back to Sean in a bit to hear some more about what TIC is doing. But Angela, I wanted to go back to you to drill in on something that Jim had mentioned. He mentioned worthiness, right? Who's worthy of getting broadband access? I wanted to ask you, how do those processes get thought through? You had the Tennessee Valley Authority, for instance, for electricity, right? Where it was an area where we knew that the people needed it, but there wasn't going to be a business case for that. But if there isn't enough of a business case for the U.S. federal government to run a cable somewhere, what kind of use case is there for average citizens? What do we need to do to make it so that everyone is worthy?
So with COVID, a positive outcome of COVID, I know that seems even dumb to say, but a positive outcome of COVID is that there's now a recognition that everyone needs to have broadband. So I don't find myself having those conversations about who's worthy anymore.
Huh.
But that's where that part is maybe taken care of. But then the more difficult part is, well, then how do we pay for it?
Mm-hmm.
Who gets served first? What really are the barriers? Should we first focus on those who don't physically have the infrastructure, or should we go at all of it? NDIA is in the team of let's go at all of it. Even places where there is infrastructure, if folks aren't subscribing, that impacts the rest of us. Health-wise, that means they're not staying at home. I would ask everyone on the call. So if you didn't have broadband, would you socially distance as much as you do? I wouldn't, right? I would get crazy lonely. So, and I would definitely go do things more out of my home. So the more folks have broadband in their home, the better it is for all of us right now in terms of taking care of this virus. So the worthiness part then comes down to, where do we spend money? Who are we first going to target? And when it comes to the infrastructure, it's an issue of targeting the areas that don't have any internet. But then if maybe they have internet, but it's crazy slow, well, should we invest there? Right. So again, NDIA is in the camp, and I know this is big dollar amounts and it really scares some folks, but if we as a country are going to compete, we have got to have really fast, reliable internet everywhere.
A new deal for broadband, maybe just get people out there laying cables.
And that is being discussed. So that's
well, my next question. Who are you lobbying? Who out there is making these decisions? Obviously, Congress makes sense to a lot of people because they control the purse. So beyond Congress, who else are you lobbying? Who can make this happen?
It really is about Congress, actually.
It's just not okay.
And I wouldn't limit it to Congress. I think that big money comes from Congress, but at local levels, it's about building the awareness and understanding what the real potential solutions are. And again, COVID has done that in a lot of places where there are individuals and institutions and governments who previously had not been engaged in digital inclusion, and now they are.
Interesting. So before we keep going, I'm going to just note we do have a pretty sizable audience on here, but no questions yet from anybody. So I'm going to keep going. If you are out there and you do have a question, now's the time to put it in there, or we're just going to run out of time on it. So, but for now, we're going to keep going. Sean, I want to come over to you because we've been talking a lot around the work you've been doing. I'd like to drill in specifically on some of the work that you're doing right now. So the TIC program, for those the uninitiated, it's in its third generation. It's being worked on right now. The drafts are out there, and you're getting pretty close to finalizing what you have out there right now.
Yeah, correct. We released our draft material in December. In January and February, we had a request for comment period. I think we had close to 400 comments coming in from a variety of both agencies and industry. So what we've been doing since then is reviewing all the material, working with the stakeholders, Jim's team at GSA, with the OMB team and some of their digital services team to update all that material. Ideally, the way we're positioning it is to release this material summer 2020. So that gives us some time period. When the pandemic hit, we had to shift our focus a little bit to release some interim telework guidance because all the demand from agencies, they were asking, just with the draft guidance released in December, what's a way, can you give us some guidance on how to use the new policy, even though it's not the policy, the guidance is a draft. Can you give some way to just help us, the agency, as the remote users are connecting to all these new services. So we had that, and it's kind of the March, April frame to release that interim telework guidance. But right now, it's a full focus on trying to get that draft guidance out the door as final as quickly as possible.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the latest version of TIC, it's not really like a policy I've ever seen before in the way that it's being managed. So you've got a basic policy out of OMB that says we need an updated TIC policy, and then kind of pushes it off to DHS and your team to figure out what that's going to be. And then your team put forth some reference architecture that some of the draft documents that you're talking about to kind of give a basic idea how this should work. And then you're going to have these use cases, and that's going to let you adapt, in the future, because you can always add more use cases. You mentioned that interim guidance, eventually that's going to get turned into a remote use case, or are those concurrent efforts? Are they working together, or are they kind of separate?
The remote user use case is one of the use cases. The ones released in December was the branch office and the traditional TIC Act, the hub and spoke, that traditional hub and the branch office. So those are the two use cases we expect to release as final first. And then, like you're saying, there's a number of other use cases that are on the hook for remote user. Some people want us to focus on the zero trust version of that. There's infrastructure as a service use case, platform as a service, software as a service. So all these other use cases that we're responsible to meet. And then there's all these other ones that we call the third phase, possibly, of other use cases above and beyond just what's in the OMB memo.
Excellent. One of the things I was trying to get to, though, is I remember you saying at one point that the interim remote user guidance is not the use case. Okay.
No, that's right. So you said the key word there, interim, right? So we released that in early April, saying it's only good through the end of December. That gives us the runway, if you will, to build out that remote user use case. Ideally, December, we release that remote user use case, and we could deprecate the interim telework guidance that we had.
Excellent. So I imagine right now you're probably getting some really great remote user use case pitches, right? I mean, you've got everybody in government has a remote user use case now. Are you getting inundated with requests for their use cases to get wrapped into that?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of examples out there to consider, right? And so I think what we're looking for is for agencies that will have a solution that will have broad adaptability across the government. There's a lot of bespoke or custom solutions, but we need ones from our level that'll have a broad acceptance across the agencies. We are working with a number of agencies on what they're doing. When I talk about the TIC program for CISA, just to be fair, there's a number of other programs in CISA. There's a program for visibility back to CISA called the Einstein program, tightly coupled with that program. So as agencies are moving these new networks, visibility comes back to CISA. There's also the CDM, Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program. That's, to put it broadly, where agencies are having tools embedded at their on-prem environments or to monitor their on-prem environments or their cloud environments. Again, it's talking about situational awareness and visibility. So when we talk about these pilots, it's not only perspective of TIC, if you will, and how the agencies can connect those new environments, but then that visibility is really of significant importance, both to the agencies for their situational awareness, for their operations, and then back to CISA, because we had a mission for that broad perspective, that panoramic perspective across government of what's going on.
Excellent. And I knew you all had questions, so here are a few of them. So we're going to take the last 10 minutes to hit a few of these. Angela, we're going to start with one for you. Both presidential candidates have made broadband access a part of their policy platforms. I'd be curious to hear Angela's thoughts on these plans. So I will just say we're a federal audience. We stay pretty non-political, but we do have two people who are vying to run the government, and they have different plans. What do you think of their plans?
Biden's plan is a little more detailed than the plan we actually haven't seen a plan from Trump, just that broadband's important. So both have stated it's important. I think where we're seeing a lot more movement is in Congress. So far, the majority of the broadband bills have come from the Democrats, but we're told that we should be expecting any day now something from the Republicans that will help us get to more of a middle ground. We also expect there to be some more negotiating between the two parties very soon, and that the possibility of a whole infrastructure bill could include broadband. And so
What-
for NDIA, we want to make sure that it includes the adoption, not just the availability.
What's the air between the two of them? What's the major differences between Democratic versus Republican proposals?
Right. Differences include how much money we spend, right? Big surprise, right there. And then also there is more understanding of the adoption issue amongst the Democrats, but we are working on that. And I do think it's really just about an understanding issue, that we're seeing more broadband adoption proposals from Democrats. So the more education we can do with Republicans is really essential, and that work is occurring now, and we need to do more of it.
Got a question here for Sean. This is one I never thought to ask you in the past, so I'd be interested here. Can vendors reach out to the TIC-3 program to propose use cases and pilots? I'm not sure if they're proposing ones for federal agencies or from themselves, but what kind of vendor outreach is allowed with the TIC program?
Yeah, so let me answer that from the pilot perspective. So if you go to CISA's website, there's a trusted internet connection web page on there, and part of the documentation's on there. There's a pilot process document on there. It explains it's going to be the pilots themselves are going to be led by the federal CISO council, not CISA, CISO council. The CISO council led through OMB. They're going to position for, let's say, a pilot proposal to the agencies. They'll give a certain amount of time, 60 days or whatever, for agencies to build out the proposals. The vendors will be working with the agencies to build out those proposals. The agencies will submit those proposals back to the federal CISO council. Jim's team, my team, a couple different teams in CISA. Then we'll all look to see which of those proposals best support the intent of that use case we're trying to work on, and then we'll go forward. But it's really led to the agencies and what they position in there. Having said that, on the back end, we do meet through GSA. We do meet with some of the vendors sometimes. There again, through CDM, through Einstein, there are a number of engagements we do have with vendors. But for the TIC pods themselves, it's really through the agencies. But I invite vendors to look at the CISO website. There's a very long document that talks about this whole process. And then even through GSA, Jim's team hosts a YouTube channel, which has a webinar that explains this whole process out.
Fantastic. Jim, next one's for you. We spoke about satellite communications. Is there a plan to leverage Starlink, SpaceX's satellite system? And I'm going to put a little extra spin on that too. Can you just talk about basic on-ramps and future additions to EIS?
Okay, so Starlink specifically, we'll leverage it when it's up and operational to the extent that we can. There's been a lot of, I was on the satellite program a long time. There were a lot of promised systems that just never seem to get completed. So you can't offer something for sale when it's not for sale. But if it is, then certainly that would be another tool in the toolkit. As far as on-ramping, we look at that from the standpoint of adding new capabilities, new services, new solutions. So new technology, certainly. So, as SD-WAN became more and more mature, and as Gartner now phrases it, when you look at their hype cycle for enterprise networking, SD-WAN is now on the slope of enlightenment, which means that agencies are learning more and more about it and they want to start implementing it, right? So that was a service that we anticipated, but we didn't define when we started the contract. Now it's defined. And that's one way we can add new things. The second thing we do is we allow our prime contractors the ability to subcontract as they need to. So again, for example, there's third-party companies out there that are proposing services and tools that will let agencies implement a distributed TIC infrastructure versus the centralized one, which is what we currently offer through MTIPS. And so our primes can add those companies as subcontractors. We don't need to approve them. We don't need to vet them because we depend on the prime service contractor. The only thing we require on the contract is that if you're going to offer a SaaS tool, a cloud-based tool to implement part of TIC3 solution, just make sure that that tool is FedRAMP compliant, certified. And so as long as they've got that, we're good to go. So, those are the ways that the contract lives and breathes, instead of just being, as Sean mentioned earlier, kind of hard to update. It's not hard to update.
Excellent. So quick point of clarification, Sean, someone's asking before, when you mentioned finding the form for the pilots, was that the CISA website or the Federal CISO Council?
Yeah, it's a good challenge, right? CISO and CISA, it's not the first time, so I apologize. It's hard to articulate, but it's the CISA webpage, DHS webpage. So if you type in your search engine, just CISA space trusted internet connections, should take you to the DHS CISA webpage. On there, again, there's a whole list of documents. We talked about all those draft documents. One of them is the pilot process document.
Excellent. Excellent. And then we're going to take the last question here, and before we're out of time. And Sean, it sounds like it's going to be one coming back at you. So, lost it here. Where'd it go? Sorry, folks, just lost my Q&A.
Physical security.
Yeah, the question's ephemeral, just like the cloud, right?
Right. Yeah. But I remember what it basically was about. So it was about SATCOM security. So as we're talking about all of these things, Sean, what does TIC say about ensuring, particularly for these rural, remote areas, if you're using a satellite system, what are the additional security measures you have to take?
So I think that's a great one where you have to explore. So TIC 1, TIC 2 was more towards that traditional boundary, the external, the internal, the north-south traffic. The east-west traffic really wasn't as much as the focus of TIC, but as we start to open up, if you will, and explore these new architectures, it comes into question about satellite. So I mentioned before about the use cases. That's another potential use case we can do in terms of like satellite connection and stuff. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think that'd be TBD. It's one we really need to explore heavily.
Excellent. With that, we are running up on the end of our time for this part of the session. I'm going to be handing it over to my colleague, Sam Jackson. Sean, Angela, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Please stay tuned for the next part of our session.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Aaron. I'm pleased to be here today with Steve Schmaltz, Field Chief Technology Officer of RSA's Public Sector, for a session presented by our underwriter, RSA. Steve, before we dive in, can you tell me a little bit more about your background and some more about RSA?
Sure. So my background, I've been in security a good 25, 30 years. I started my career at NSA as a cryptologist. It's surprising I can't say it, that I actually did it for a living once. I joined the private sector in 2000, where I've been focusing on sort of matching security solutions to customers ever since. RSA is focused on risk management. We're focused on making sure that customers understand how to deal with digital transformation, how to identify security risks, and to address them through visibility, analysis, and the setting of controls.
Perfect. Well, let's get into it. We heard a lot from the previous panel about securely expanding some government agencies' network bandwidth. So clearly a critical part of digital transformation. What are some cybersecurity pillars that you're seeing as foundational for digital transformation?
Well, I'm gonna go right back to visibility. I mean, we heard a lot about sort of the different generations of networking that makes up our access today. So if you're teleworking, depending on where you're at, you could be getting back into your office on the most modern network infrastructure, or you could be using something that's 10, 15, 20 years old. So in an environment like that, having visibility and being able to see potential threats that may pop up that you didn't have before when you had fewer people at home and more people at work is probably the place you need to start. And without that visibility, without being able to look at network traffic, to analyze logs, maybe to view the endpoint of the individual teleworking in, without being able to do that, it's hard to do any analysis. And it's hard to determine what controls you really need to put in place. So it all starts with that visibility.
Perfect. And I just kind of want to pull the thread of telework that you mentioned then. So right now, remote connections are rapidly expanding, and it's straining networks and introducing new vulnerabilities. So How are you able to provide strong authentication during this era of telework? And can you talk to me a little bit more about the importance of expanding or re-architecting those frameworks?
Sure. So, strong authentication is important, but I think before you get to that, it's back to the theme of visibility. You want to make sure that you know who has access to what. People go home, they're using their VPN to get access to the resources they had access to before. There's an emergency. Maybe there's not as much attention paid to who gets access to what. And to make sure people can do their jobs, you may quickly give people a lot broader access than they had in the past. So starting with that visibility into the process of how you assign access, make sure the right people are making the decisions. If you have to give broader access than you did in the past, making sure that you take that into account as you move forward, that you do a little bit more monitoring, that you do some behavioral analytics if you can, just to make sure that large files aren't leaving the organization that weren't going to particular individuals before. Now, once that's done, then putting strong two-factor authentication, making sure that your access portals are locked down, all of that will be much more effective. Because obviously, it doesn't matter what kind of lock you have on your door. If you give a stranger the key to your door, they're going to get into how effective that is.
Perfect. And in your opinion, what do you see as the biggest cybersecurity risk right now from our shift to maximum telework?
So I see that there was some excellent discussion, about how security plays into this, and from the previous panelists. And again, as people work from home, it stretches the infrastructure of the organization. And when you talk about digital disruption, that's the sort of maximum amount of digital disruption that you can get when people are suddenly not even able to get in and trying to do things from home they never did before. So a lot of ways that agencies address this are to lean much more on cloud services. So they may not be able to expand quickly enough. And I think we've heard instances of where cloud services could augment, the networking infrastructure to allow people to get access. So in that arena, making sure that whatever FISMA posture, and I'm sure that almost everybody on the call is on the webcast is familiar with FISMA, making sure that whatever FISMA posture you have for your organization internally gets translated out to those cloud service providers. Because it's not just during the COVID-19 pandemic that we have right now. As we go forward, we're going to be doing more and more cloud services. It's going to become more popular. Fortunately, you heard the mention of FedRAMP, which basically makes us, the vendor, providing you those cloud services, do our own sort of FISMA compliance, meet our own sets of controls in our cloud service. So to me, that's the most important thing. Make sure those vendors providing you those services meet the requirements that you have. Pay attention to that. That's, to me, is one of the biggest risks as we lean on this new evolving infrastructure, cloud infrastructure for everything, including security. Let's make sure that they're secure.
That's a great point. I think that continuous dialogue of agency and provider is more important now than ever and will continue to grow in importance. So I want to talk a little bit about a threat that loomed pre-pandemic that continues to be a concern, and that's malware. So right now, much of the communication around monitoring for malware has become external where it used to be internal. So can you talk a little bit about how you're handling that challenge?
Sure. So again, I mentioned before visibility, the ability to monitor network traffic, to look at logs, and to look at endpoints. So in RSA's view, in order to get a handle on that, you need to use all of those resources. It's not just good enough to collect your logs and put them somewhere in case there's a problem. It's not good enough to turn on some automatic malware detection at your endpoint on your desktop or laptop. It's just as important to monitor network traffic and to aggregate all of that so that you can do analytics and you can jump from something that you see on the endpoint. If you may notice on the endpoint some behavior, a process running that you've never seen before. It may be malware, it may not. You can then look and see whether or not communication from that endpoint through the network traffic that you capture has similar activity through the network traffic going to other endpoints. And then you can even pull the logs back and see if historically you've seen something similar happen. That wide visibility and the ability to do analytics across all of that information to RSA is the key. Now, of course, just as important is making sure that everyone, that all of us, we're all in the same situation, trying to battle, these evolving viruses, malware that is. Make sure that we understand what we're seeing and that we communicate with each other. So sharing that data is extremely important as well. So being able to aggregate data externally and compare it to what you're seeing is also important. And finally, once you've done the analysis, once you've looked and you've seen what potentially looks like a threat, how do you react to it? So being able to have a plan in place or the infrastructure in place to act on that, to figure out what endpoints need to be shut down, what activity needs to be changed, what workflows need to be tweaked. All of that is important in addressing this new challenge.
It's a great answer. I want to talk about something that the panel brought up as well in our last couple of minutes for the discussion, and that's we heard a lot about digital equity in the previous conversation, and especially around efforts to expand broadband access so that government can provide virtual services to everyone. So when we think about that, what's the calculus in balancing expanding internet access with the cyber concerns?
That's a tough question. So as you're giving access to government resources to more and more citizens through the internet, there are a couple of challenges that so if you're dealing with your own with a government agency's employees, you can provision those individuals with credentials, with authenticators to get access to your resources. Maybe not easily, but you can bring them in if necessary. You can make sure they are who they say they are before you hand them some type of authenticator. When it comes to the public at large, that's a little bit more difficult. So you have to look at ways of provisioning and of identity proofing that may be a little bit different than you had before. Just as importantly, and back to the access piece, you need to make sure that that you're limiting access to those people requesting services to just what they need. And then once that's all done, you have to find a way to quickly provision them with authenticators that make sense at that scale. And there's a big challenge. You know that NIST has already put out guidance when it comes to using SMS as a means of authentication. That is not considered as secure. Maybe it was never considered all that secure, but it certainly isn't blessed by anyone these days as being something that you want to use. So what do you find that sort of fits the ease of use of something like that you can very easily distribute to the citizens to get access to your website? So addressing all of these issues, it's a challenge, but it's something that I think that we're going to work our way through. Obviously, leveraging mobile devices as authenticators is something we're going to do. If it's not SMS, it's probably going to be some other form of secure application. So those are the things that I would think about when I'm trying to address this issue.
Yeah, it's a big task, but I think, we have reason to be optimistic. So thanks so much for that answer. With just a minute or two left, I want to give you the floor to kind of respond on anything we haven't touched on with the panel that preceded us. And I also want to get your thoughts on leaving our audience with one thing the audience can do this week to strengthen their security posture.
I've been thinking about this, and there's been a lot of great content today. But I look back in my career as a cryptomatic. I did it, a cryptologic mathematician, and I look back, which is a lot of people consider that reasonably complex arena. But my success in that role really was based on finding the basic, simple things that you could do. When I say simple, I've seen so many security solutions that were unbelievably complex, that involved multiple moving pieces, that had dozens of people, checking hundreds of controls. And in today's world, if you're a government employee and if you're dealing with security, that you can't get around that long control checklist. But thinking about the problem at a high level and addressing the low-hanging fruit making sure that that individuals have access to only what they need to have access to, making sure that as you're providing authenticators that you standardize on that, keeping the solutions as straightforward and simple for your IT staff as well as for your customers. That's the key, because with complexity comes risk. The digital risk I talked about, the root of that is the complexity of our modern world and the complexity of the digital solution. And in fact, it's very often the biggest complexity comes in backwards compatibility, which we had some discussion before, where you've got older networking infrastructure with newer stuff laid on top. You really have to look at that and try to get a clear feel for what is important and focus on the straightforward, low-hanging fruit, and try to keep those solutions as simple and as clean as possible, both for your IT people and for your customers.
There you have it. All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Steve. And with that, we have reached the end of our program. So once again, I want to thank all of our speakers and Steve for joining us today. And thank you, our audience, for tuning in. This event would not have been possible without the support of our founding underwriter, Karasoff, and our presenting underwriter, RSA. For more information on RSA and the work they're doing, be sure to check out the resources in the chat. This full webcast has been recorded and will be sent to you by the end of the week. So we encourage you to keep a watch for it in your email and be sure to share the conversation with your colleagues. Once again, we thank you for joining us and we hope you all stay safe and healthy and have a great day.